Yeah, so thank you all for coming. This was our annual survey that we do. We do every January and May, we conduct a survey that focuses on state budget issues, and this year was no exception. I know most of you are already familiar with the statewide survey, but for those of you who are not, I want to say just a word about the mission of the statewide survey, which is to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on the political, social, and economic opinions of California residents. It has a goal to inform and improve the state policymaking process, raise awareness, encourage discussion. We also hope by doing this that we're providing a voice for all Californians beyond just what voters can do at the ballot box. Since the survey director, Mark Baldassari, started the survey in 1998, we've interviewed over 260,000 Californians, California adults, I should say, 18 and over, in more than 120 surveys. So we already mentioned that the Irvine Foundation provided funding for this survey. The survey this time, as I mentioned, focused in large part on the California state budget as well as fiscal attitudes among Californians. We took a look at general fiscal attitudes as well as specific attitudes towards some of the proposals in the governor's budget plan. We also wanted to provide some information sort of about the political context at both the state and federal level, and provide some information about how Californians assess the job that their state elected officials and federal elected officials are doing. We also wanted to take a brief look at the 2012 elections and the upcoming GOP primary. Just a few notes about how we conducted the survey. We conducted interviews from January 10th through 17th. This included telephone interviews with about 2,000 Californians. Of that group, we considered about 890 to be those who are likely to vote based on questions about voter registration, citizenship, participation in past election, intentions to vote, that type of thing. The margin of error for the total sample is plus or minus 3.4 percentage points. I also wanted to mention that the surveys are conducted in either English or Spanish, according to the respondent's preference, and we include interviews on both landline phones as well as cell phones. Finally, I wanted to make a brief mention about the timing of this particular survey. So we started conducting the survey after the governor released his budget, so we were able to ask some specific questions about the budget proposal. But it was also before the Attorney General released the title and summary of the governor's proposed tax initiative. And it was also, we finished our interviews the night before the governor gave his state address. And then actually when I get into the questions about the GOP primary, we conducted the interviews after the Iowa caucuses while people still thought Mitt Romney was the winner. During the fielding period, the New Hampshire primary took place, and then after the survey, South Carolina took place. So it's hard to say whether the results we found for that race would be the same if we asked today, but nevertheless, I'll show you that toward the end of the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to start off with talking about some of the budget and fiscal issues. And actually, before I talk about this particular question, I wanted to mention we asked a question that we've been tracking for a number of years about whether the state's budget situation is a problem. And we found that strong majorities of both adults, I'll refer to adults as the full sample, and then those we consider likely to vote, consider the state budget situation to be a big problem. And there's continued recognition that the state's budget cuts are starting to affect local services, such as those provided by cities, counties, and school districts. We found 6 in 10 of both adults and likely voters say that their local services have been affected a lot by state budget cuts. So when it comes to preferences for how to close the state's budget deficit, we find sort of mixed results among both adults and likely voters. We find that close to 4 in 10 think that the state should use mostly spending cuts to resolve the deficit, while a similar proportion think that a combination of cuts and tax increases should be used. Far fewer would say that tax increases alone would be the best way to approach the deficit, and then relatively few think it would be okay to borrow and run a deficit. But we do find a partisan divide on this question, with the strong majority of Republicans feeling that spending cuts alone would be the best way to resolve the budget deficit, whereas Democrats feel that either, a good majority of Democrats would say a mix or tax increases. I should say a majority of Democrats feel that tax increases should be part of whatever solution is used to close the deficit. Independents are more likely to say a mix than mostly cuts. This is a question that we've been tracking since the 2003 budget crisis. We tell respondents what the 4 major areas of state spending are and ask which of these areas is most important to protect from spending cuts. And as we've found since we first started asking it, a majority of adults and likely voters believe that K-12 education is the area that's most important to protect from spending cuts. And we find widespread agreement across political parties, across the state's regions, across various demographic groups, race, ethnicity, income levels, education levels, age, et cetera. K-12 is definitely the area that people prioritize the most. And I think this is an important question in the survey because it perhaps explains the levels of support that we're seeing at this point in time for the governor's proposed tax increase. But despite some of those opinions, most Californians believe, and likely voters, believe that the state could spend less and still provide the same level of services. We find 59% of adults and 55% of likely voters hold this view. But you do see that there is somewhat of a decline since '04 and actually since January 2008 in the percentage holding this view. Perhaps this is some recognition of the fact that services have been cut quite a bit already. And then we did ask a follow-up question. So among these people who feel that the state could cut spending without reducing service levels, we wanted to find out, well, how much do you think the state could actually cut and maintain these services? So I'll try not, these are a lot of percentages, so hopefully this will make sense. So 18% of Californians who believe the state could cut spending believe it could cut under 10% of its spending and still provide the same services. 41% believe it could cut between 10 and 20%, and 34% actually think the state could cut 20% or more and still maintain the same service levels that it has now. We do, of course, not too surprising, find some partisan differences on this general question about whether the state could cut spending. Republicans and independents think the state could cut spending. Democrats are more likely to say that it could not than it could. We repeated a question. We've been tracking this for some time. This is sort of our fundamental question about size of government. It's sort of the crux of the fiscal difference between Democrats and Republicans often. So we find that California adults are slightly more likely to say that they would prefer paying higher taxes and have a state government that provides more services rather than paying, 41% say they'd rather pay lower taxes and have a state government that provides fewer services. But when we look at the group of likely voters, there's more division, and then there's a very wide partisan divide on this question, and independents somewhat more likely to fall on the side of lower taxes and fewer services. So just to provide some of the sort of past information on this question, we've found that Californians are very often divided pretty evenly on this size of government question, and when they're not divided, they tend, like they do today, to fall somewhat more on the side of higher taxes and more services. Californians also see the need for sort of a check on the spending power of state elected officials. We find 6 in 10 adults and likely voters think it would be a good idea to strictly limit the amount that state spending could increase each year. And as far as I know, the assembly bill that was approved to be put before voters has now been put off until November 2014, but it's a measure that would ask voters about this very idea. We find that there's majority support across parties, although Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to consider this a good idea. We've found that since 2003, strong majorities have expressed support for the idea of a state spending limit. But I did find this interesting, and we'll of course repeat this question in future surveys. But just since last May, we saw a drop of 13 points among adults and 13 points among likely voters in the share saying that it would be a good idea to strictly limit state spending. I'm not exactly sure what explains that decline and whether that decline will continue to emerge in future surveys or not. That's why we'll keep asking it. I wanted to mention too, the handouts that you received on your chairs, there's a few of the charts that are on those sheets are also, I'm going to replicate here, but if it's easier for you to look at that. So this is an example of one of the charts that's on your handout. We wanted to again mention to respondents what the 4 largest areas of state spending are and find out if they would be willing to pay, in general, be willing to pay higher taxes to maintain current levels of funding for each of those areas. We find, as we have in the past, that a majority say they would pay higher taxes to maintain funding for K-12 public education. Among likely voters, just under half say they would for health and human services or for higher education. When we look at the full sample of all adults, we find 57% would pay higher taxes for health and human services and for higher education. The least popular area of state spending, prisons and corrections, only about 1 in 10 say they would pay higher taxes to maintain funding for that area. We find that an overwhelming majority of Democrats and 60% of independents say they would pay higher taxes to maintain funding for K-12 education. A very slim majority of Republicans say they would not be willing to pay taxes for this purpose. In other groups, regional groups and other demographic groups, we find that majority support for the idea of paying higher taxes for K-12 education. Again, this is one of our sort of fiscal tracking questions that I think, again, helps explain some of the levels of support that we're seeing for the governor's tax proposal, at least at this point, and we'll get into that momentarily. Now, before we asked respondents about the governor's budget plan, we wanted to ask some of our past questions about specific types of taxes and whether gauge levels of support or opposition for those. So 2 of them that are components of the governor's plan are raising the state sales tax and raising income taxes on the wealthy. We find strong opposition among likely voters for the idea of raising the state sales tax on all purchases. We've found consistent opposition to this question since we started asking it in January 2004, and these results are almost identical to what we found when we asked this last January. The idea of raising the top rate on top rate of the state income tax paid by the wealthiest Californians, on the other hand, has strong support among likely voters, 68%. And we find that across parties, majorities oppose raising the state sales tax, including 54% of Democrats. And then strong majorities of Democrats and independents like the idea of raising taxes on the wealthy, while a slim majority of Republicans is opposed to that idea. Now, we included 3 other types of taxes that people have been talking about. And we find additional evidence that Californians are open to this idea of taxing other groups of people. So, for example, we find solid support for the idea of a split roll tax, that is taxing commercial properties at their current market value. We also find strong support for the idea of raising taxes on California corporations. And then we find Similar to the idea of raising the sales tax in general, we find opposition to the idea of extending the sales tax to services that are not currently taxed. Let's see. When we look at these questions by party, we find that Democrats and independents are in favor of raising corporate taxes. Republicans are opposed. On the idea of the split roll property tax, Democrats and independents are in favor of that, while Republicans are divided. And then when it comes to extending the sales tax to services, we find that majorities of independents and Republicans are opposed to that idea, especially Republicans, while this is one sales tax idea that Democrats are slightly more likely to favor the idea than oppose it. So we read a brief description to respondents about the governor's budget proposal. We mentioned the governor's projected size of the state budget deficit and mentioned that the proposal would include spending cuts to welfare, child care, Medi-Cal, and other social services, that it would increase spending for K-12 education, and that it would require voter approval for temporary tax increases. And we find overall that 50% of adults say they favor the plan in general. Likely voters are more divided, and we do see a partisan divide with Democrats saying they're in favor and Republicans opposed. So then we asked about three of the key elements of the proposal, starting with how people feel about the service cuts to welfare, child care, Medi-Cal, and other social service programs. And we find that 58% of adults are opposed to these cuts. Slightly fewer likely voters are opposed, but they're slightly more likely to oppose it than favor it. And then across parties, a solid majority of Democrats are opposed to these types of cuts, while Republicans are in favor and independents are divided. We do find on this question that as your household income level rises, there's greater support for cutting for these types of cuts. I also wanted to mention, I know a lot of you have probably seen the coverage of the survey in the news already, so I wanted to maybe try to find a few tidbits that deeper in the data that you maybe haven't heard about already. So one example would be if we look at the people, see on this, if we go back to this previous slide. So among those people who say that they favor the plan overall, we find that 51% favor these proposed spending cuts to social services. Then when we look at the 43% who say they oppose the governor's plan, 70% are opposed to these social service cuts. So I think perhaps this is one area that might be driving some of the opposition to the governor's overall budget plan. So on to the proposed tax initiative. Again, the title and the official title and summary were not released before we started fielding the survey. So we talked about the governor's proposed tax initiative, how it would have a temporary 4-year increase, 1 cent increase in the state sales tax, and a temporary 5-year increase in the state income tax on individuals earning more than $250,000 a year, and that the new revenues raised would go to K-12 schools. We find that this proposal, at least at this point, has very broad appeal. 72% of adults and 68% of likely voters say they favor this proposal. And this includes majorities across parties, although Democrats are the most likely to favor this plan, and 2/3 of independents are in favor. Republicans at this point are somewhat more likely to be in favor than to say they're opposed to this. And we do see that this I kind of want to get into this question a little bit more than some of our other questions, because this is obviously one of the more important findings from the survey. Attitudes about this proposed tax initiative do seem to be linked somewhat to Governor Brown. So for example, of those who say they approve of his job performance or who say that they favor his overall budget plan, we find that more than 8 in 10 favor the idea of this tax initiative. But what's also interesting is that even among those who disapprove of the governor and oppose his overall plan, we find that just over half, say they also favor this proposed tax initiative. And then if your eyes aren't glazing over at all these numbers yet, One other interesting thing I thought was that among those likely voters, we found that pretty solid majority of likely voters saying they oppose the general idea of raising the state sales tax. Well, even among those people, 56% right now are in favor of this proposed tax initiative. So we'll, of course, continue to track attitudes about this as the election season goes on and see what happens as the yes and no campaigns get going. Now, finally, we asked one last question about the governor's budget plan, and this had to do with the proposed trigger cuts to K-12 education that would happen if voters rejected the proposed tax initiative. So we find strong opposition among adults and likely voters to the proposed automatic spending cuts, and there's widespread opposition across parties, regions, and demographic groups. There's opposition to these trigger cuts among both those who favor the governor's budget plan and those who oppose it. So in other words, it doesn't matter how you feel about the governor's overall budget plan, most people are going to be opposed to these proposed trigger cuts. One of the key ideas that the governor had in last year's budget proposal and in this year's budget proposal is shifting some of the state responsibilities down to the local level. So we started asking about the idea of realignment last January. We've asked about it 4 times, including in this survey. And before I talk about these confidence questions, I wanted to mention that overall, we find that 2 in 3 adults and likely voters favor the general idea of shifting certain responsibilities from the state to local level. And we found that at least 6 in 10 in each of our 4 surveys have expressed favor for that idea. Now, we wanted to find out, well, you think it's a good idea? Are you confident that your local governments could handle these responsibilities? So we find that about 6 in 10 adults and likely voters say that they are very or somewhat confident that their local governments could handle these new responsibilities. And then we asked a second question about how confident they are in local governments to handle well, we briefly described to respondents this idea of certain lower risk inmates being shifted from state prisons to county jails, and then ask if they're confident if their local government could handle those responsibilities. About half say they're very or somewhat confident, which is somewhat lower than their confidence in local governments to handle realignment in general. Okay. Given the proposed taxes that could be on the November ballot, we wanted to get some idea of how respondents perceive the state and local tax system and their own individual tax burden. The majority of Californians and likely voters consider the state and local tax system to be very or moderately fair. Most of these people fall in the moderately fair category. And we actually find that at least half across parties, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, say that the state and local tax system is at least moderately fair. We've found similar results the last 2 Januaries that we've asked this question, January 10 and January 11. However, when we first asked this in June 2003, we found a slightly higher percentage, 66%, saying that they considered this tax system to be at least moderately fair. Now, when it comes to people's perceptions of their own individual tax burden, we find that 46% of adults think that they pay much more or somewhat more than they should in taxes. About close to half think they pay the right amount, and 6% actually think they pay less than they should. The results are similar among likely voters, and we actually see, in the question this time, we see a slight decline. We asked the same question in 2010 and 2011, and we found slightly higher percentages in those surveys saying they thought they paid more than they should in taxes. So we've actually seen an increase in the percentage saying they pay the right amount and a decline in the percentage saying they pay more than they should. I think this might shock you, but Democrats think they pay the right amount or less, and Republicans think they pay more than they should. Okay, so finally, this will be my last slide on the state budget issues. We wanted to find out how much people think they know about how their state and local governments spend and raise money. So we before these two questions about the actual areas of spending and revenues, we asked a question, just how much would you say you know about how your state and local governments spend and raise money? We found that among adults, 54% said they knew a lot or some, just 16% actually in the a lot category, 38% in the some category. Among likely voters, 69% said that they know a lot or some about how state and local governments spend money. What is sort of interesting, though, is that since, I mean, we've had all these budget crises basically since, you know, for a number of years now, and self-reported knowledge of budgets has not grown in that time. Okay, so then when we wanted to find out if Californians were aware of what the top spending area is and what the top revenue source is. So just 16% of Californians are aware that K-12 education comprises the largest area of state spending. Most adults and likely voters think the bulk of state spending is on prisons and corrections. And just 29% of adults and 35% of likely voters are aware that the state personal income tax is the top revenue source. When we combine these questions, we find that only 7% of adults and 11% of likely voters are able to correctly name both the top spending and revenue areas. And when we look at those people who say they know a lot or some, the results are similar to these overall. So it perhaps explains, you know, some of the questions about people thinking that state could spend less and still maintain the same level of services. If they think it's, you know, the bulk of spending is going to prisons, they undoubtedly are, you know, are thinking of that type of spending too. At the same time, I think an important contextual issue, which I'm going to get into in a moment, has to do with how Californians view their elected officials as well. So we'll talk about that momentarily. So going into, you know, entering the season of budget negotiations as well as the 2012 election, we did want to gather opinions about the overall mood of residents and attitudes toward their elected officials. So first, we ask this question each January. What one issue facing California do you think is the most important for the governor and state legislature to work on in 2012? And for those of you who are familiar with our surveys, we ask a similar question in almost every survey about just what's the most important issue facing the state. And you get, you know, the results are slightly different for that versus what the governor and the legislature should work on. So we find in the survey today, 38% of adults say that jobs in the economy are the top issue for the governor and legislature to work on this year. 18% name the state budget, 16% schools, and 7% immigration. And just to put this question in context, when the state was not in such a fiscal crisis, immigration used to be the issue that would top this list. That obviously shifted once the deficit started growing. We find similar proportions across parties name jobs in the economy as the top issue. When it comes to the other issues, Republicans are more likely than others to name the state budget as the most important issue, and Democrats are more likely than others to name education. And we also find, you know, these concerns about the economy are also reflected in a couple of our other questions. We find 77% of Californians believe the state is in a serious or moderate economic recession. Almost half say it's serious. And we find that a majority say that the state can expect bad times financially over the next 12 months. This sort of pessimism is also reflected in this question about what direction the state's headed in. We find a majority of adults and 2 in 3 likely voters believe the state's headed in the wrong direction. But you can see here on this chart that pessimism is much higher among Republicans than it is among independents, and Democrats are actually somewhat more likely to say that the state's headed in the right direction. And this question is also sort of linked to attitudes toward the governor. majorities who approve of the governor's job performance think that the state's going in the right direction. Among those who disapprove of his job performance, 9 in 10 think the state's going in the wrong direction. So we have found that among all adults since last January, that Governor Brown's approval ratings have sort of been hovering in this just over 40% range. We saw a dip in March of last year, and then today, this is actually, 46% is actually the highest among all adults that we've found since he took office. But likely voters, the findings are a little bit different. So last January, 47% of likely voters said they approved. Today, that's at 44%. But disapproval among likely voters, and this is sort of important given what's going to be happening this year, disapproval is up 18 points since last January, from 20% to 38% today. So basically, what's been happening is as people are less likely to say they are unsure about his performance, those people are sort of moving into the disapproval camp, at least right now. We do find voters are divided along party lines. And when it comes to the state legislature, approval ratings remain very low. 28% of adults and only 17% of likely voters say they approve. Actually, an overwhelming, if we look at it the other way, an overwhelming majority of likely voters say they disapprove of the state legislature. Again, keep in mind our survey was also conducted before the legislature filed its lawsuit against the state controller this past week. So I would speculate that that's not going to help their approval rating. Okay. Oh, and there was a third approval question at the state level. We asked respondents how they felt about their individual assembly and Senate members. And we find approval is slightly higher for their specific legislators, but not much. About 1 in 3 adults and likely voters say they approve. And that's going to be interesting, I guess, this year with the new top 2 primary and the new districts. We'll continue to track attitudes about those people. We also wanted to find out if Californians thought the governor and legislature would be able to work together and accomplish a lot this year. We find adults are divided, likely voters are pessimistic, Republicans very pessimistic, about half of Democrats think they will be able to cooperate. We asked this question last year when the governor just took office, and at that time a majority of adults and just over half of likely voters thought they would be able to work together. We also wanted to ask this question at the federal level, and Californians are more pessimistic about the prospects of President Obama and the U.S. Congress being able to work together and accomplish a lot. Majorities across parties feel this way, although Democrats are holding out a little bit more hope, I guess, than Republicans and independents. And then to provide some of the past findings on this one's kind of interesting. So last year, in the last time we asked this question was January 2010, so two Januaries ago. 56% of adults and 48% of likely voters thought the president and Congress would be able to work together and accomplish a lot. And then when the president first took office and had a democratically controlled Congress, 8 in 10 adults and likely voters thought they'd be able to work together and accomplish a lot. It was kind of interesting. Okay, so we're also tracking approval ratings on the president and Congress. We find that heading into his re-election bid, 54% of Californians say they approve of President Obama. 49% of likely voters disapprove. That September 2011 finding was the lowest approval rating we've recorded for the president. He's never really been able to recover the high levels that he had when he first took office. Another interesting tidbit about his approval ratings today, these are the exact same ratings that President Bush had in January 2004 heading into his re-election bid. Of course, there's a wide partisan divide with most Democrats saying they approve, most Republicans saying they disapprove. We find very low approval ratings for the U.S. Congress, similar to the state legislature. Although this is a slight improvement since December, when they had hit their record low of 20% among all adults and 9% among likely voters. And actually, congressional approval, or I should say congressional disapproval, is one area where we find bipartisan agreement. So. Okay, and we also wanted to ask about their individual representatives to the U.S. House, since these people will be up for re-election this year, and many in having new district lines. We find higher approval ratings for their individual House representatives than for the Congress overall, but these ratings among adults and likely voters are around the record lows that we've recorded in the past. And we don't see much difference across regions, slightly fewer than half saying they approve. Senator Feinstein will also be up for re-election this year, although as of now she doesn't really have any opponents. 47% say they approve of her job performance. A similar share approve of Senator Boxer's job performance. Findings are the same among likely voters. There's a wide partisan divide. Approval is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area, not too surprising, that's where they're both from. When Senator Feinstein was up for re-election last time, we found, at this similar point in the election cycle, we found 51% of adults saying they approved, and a somewhat higher share of likely voters, 56% saying they approved. Okay, so the GOP primary, again, this was before South Carolina, although, who knows what this would be today, because the polls keep changing. Republicans keep changing their minds about these guys. The other thing I should mention is we were conducting surveys as John Huntsman and Rick Perry dropped out of the race. So we took the second choice. We allocated those people's second choice. We asked them who they would vote for if those people were in the race, and recalculated it to show the people who are still in the race. 37% would support Romney, 18% Newt Gingrich, and this is sort of a reversal from when we first asked this in December. 33% of Republican likely voters favored Gingrich and 25% Romney. And I think some of the changing attitudes among Republicans are reflected in this question, which shows Republican likely voters are more likely to say they're not satisfied with their candidate choices. 2/3 of Democrats are satisfied. So I think that explains a lot of what's going on. And importantly, this group of independent likely voters is also more likely to say they're not satisfied than satisfied. We also asked one last question about the 2012 election, which is how closely are you following news about the candidates? We find a very strong majority say they're following news very closely or fairly closely. Republicans slightly more likely than Democrats or independents to say they're following the news very closely. So I'll just conclude with a few remarks and then we can get into questions. So again, Californians say, of the 4 top state spending areas, Californians are most likely to say they would protect K-12 education from spending cuts, and they're willing to pay higher taxes to maintain funding levels for this area. This perhaps helps explain why the governor's tax initiative has high support today. But 2 of our other questions show why the tax initiative might be a challenge to get passed. There's high support for the idea of raising taxes on the wealthy, but very high opposition to the idea of raising the state sales tax. Nationally, well, we just talked about this stuff, but Californians are more pessimistic about, Californians are pessimistic about the prospects for state leaders as well as federal leaders working together and accomplishing a lot.